When I was a child, I used to sing a lot of Bach, and my father was a conductor of Bach and was right at the cutting edge of new performance practice back in the 60s. How did you come to Bach?
Well, wait, what was the first Bach you sang?
It was always this Matthäus-Passion.
Really?
I was a cathedral chorister, and we did it every year. And there was something called the Oxford Bach Festival. I was a choir boy in Oxford, England. And the choir I sang in did the Cantus Firmus in numbers 1 and 29 every year at the Oxford Bach Festival with all the most famous conductors of the 60s. And meanwhile, my dad had bought the new Bärenreiter edition and was studying how to do it in a new way. And my childhood is full of orchestral parts and scores and pencil sharpeners and worrying about non-vibrato and whether the speeds are too slow. So this is mother's milk to me.
Oh, that's fantastic. I really was adopted when I was 21 by a group of musicians in Boston at Emmanuel Church. And at Emmanuel, they sang the complete Bach cantatas, a cantata every Sunday in the service for 35 years.
Wow.
And so Bach was something that was ongoing every single week. Mm-hmm. But of course, for me, what was beautiful is I grew up like everybody with Glenn Gould and with, this idea of Bach as this great abstract composer. And it wasn't till 10 years at Emmanuel where you got this music is not abstract at all. It is totally, with these words, about lived experience. And it's not a stylistic question. It's a question of truly engaging people's lives. And at Emmanuel, at that era, they had a homeless shelter, shelter for battered women, a Salvadoran refugee program because Salvadorans were escaping the death squads, and there was a kind of underground railroad because they were being attacked by the Reagan administration once they got to America. So there were safe houses. There were 3 chapters of Alcoholics Anonymous. There was drug counseling, and of course there was a suicide prevention center. Mm-hmm. And when you hear Bach Cantata 199, after convincing someone not to kill themselves, you get that this music is deeply practical. And like Alcoholics Anonymous, it's a 12-step program. Mm-hmm. You take each step with Bach, and Bach takes you and guides you through the next steps of your life, through turning things around towards recovery. And this music is literally, the reason there's so many notes is because the path is steep towards changing your own life. And the reason Bach is making the most extreme demands of the instrumentalists and the vocalists is because changing your life is really hard and involves, you think you can move forward, but then you go back. And you think you're making progress, but then you lose the way. And so it keeps repeating, but not quite, the actual struggle in the phrases, and of course then these amazing moments of harmonic convergence, where even when you stumble, actually the harmony tells you you're coming home. And this incredible way in which Bach puts hope in the most tortured path is through these incredible moments of harmonic enlightenment, where you sense, even at the crisis point, that you're coming closer to your real self, and that you shouldn't give up. You should keep going. And Bach uses the harmonies to keep drawing you on. I feel something drawing me on, and that's Bach's harmonic universe. And so these incredible convergences were really deep to me when we were performing this material in the context of broken lives, people arriving at a crisis point in their life where they need support, where they need someone to be with them. And early on, I started staging these cantatas.
So your very first meeting with Bach at Emmanuel Church was simply, working with the choir and the soloists on what the text meant, or were you already staging?
I was working on Mozart and Handel and Peter Maxwell Davies and all kinds of other things with the same group of musicians. And then I would just go to their Bach rehearsals every week.
All right.
And so I was just a friend of the family. And gradually, this became the air we all breathed. This became, and gradually, of course, Bach is the great, if I could say, Bible of Western music. Everything's in there. And particularly the cantatas have such an incredible range of new shapes, new experimental ideas, amazing juxtapositions. It's such a, for a body of music, it is like the Beethoven sonatas, non-normative. Everything is a norm in one sonata is not a norm in the next sonata. That kind of, that exploratory universe. And also, after a while, I just started saying, well, we should stage some of these cantatas because they were so powerful, they were so vivid. And Bach, again, paints such intense, vivid pictures. Sometimes it's abstract in the sense of the soul leaving the body. Mm-hmm. There's no picture that we have for that. And yet, Bach really does give you a musical picture of the struggle of the soul to leave the body. It's not a material thing. Therefore, it can only be metaphysically indicated by music. On the other hand, there are plenty of other things, which is literally, you should distribute bread to the poor. And the cantata has the bread being broken and handed around. And musically, you can't miss the image. What's marvelous is a bunch of Bach's music is so pictorial or is engaged in the body practices, the last breathing as someone's leaving the world, that labored breath. Bach is very intent on the breath or the heartbeat. Or, so often Bach's music is so corporeal, it's so sensuous. He's using the winds and the strings to give you touch, to give you something so physically present. And I think that's probably one of the great elements of the German tradition from Grunewald on, this super in the body spiritual experience, and actually with details that are in some ways horrifying. They're so vivid, but it's understood that it's not just in the mind, but that this salvation, transformation, and struggle is in the body. And Bach is writing, the Matthäus-Passion is mostly music for the body. Bach is always referring to Jesus' body, to the body of Mary Magdalene. It's so vividly experiential, mm-hmm. rather than a kind of intellectual proposition. Now, that Bach is so intellectually dazzling means that, yes, there's a whole lot of stuff upstairs going on, of course, but actually, this is a guy with 20 kids. This is a guy who knows what it is to live in the body and in the world. And what that tension is the source of the music. And I think one of the coolest things about this music is that it's constantly in tension. And, we've talked about this a lot, Simon, but that Bach is more the composer of doubt than the composer of affirmation. Mm-hmm. That the music is at its most intense, depicting struggle, depicting a divided mind, a divided self, being torn apart, knirscht, being, the fabulous verb in Bus and Roy. This Bach gets his musical language from the knirscht of the spirit and the body, from the knirscht of the person you want to be and the person you are every day instead. The struggle between your multiple selves and your multiple impulses and what you've achieved and what you have totally failed to achieve. And that struggle is at the heart of the composition.
And when did you come to this particular piece, to the St. Matthew-Passion? Did you come to this later on? Is it a piece you've struggled with over the years, or something that you've always had as the vision of one of the things you really wanted to get to terms with?
I staged a lot of Bach at Emmanuel in Boston But the conductor, Craig Smith, the one thing he would not tolerate is by touching the St. Matthew Passion ever. I once asked him, now, Craig, how could we approach the St. Matthew Passion? He said, you do it in church on Good Friday, and that's enough. So it was out of the question.
And was that also his feeling about the St. John as well, or is it that St. Matthew has this sort of tradition of holy aura about it?
Well, I think everybody knows it's the great piece of music in the Western classical tradition. I mean, than which there is no piece more overwhelming in scope, overwhelming in range, overwhelming in kind of depth of emotional color and what it's asking from the musicians. I mean, there's no piece to even compare to it. And so it is a monument. It is the Mount Everest. And so you admire it. And it's very unusual to have a project like this where we're actually not admiring it from a distance, but we're actually opening it and going inside rather than admiring it as a monument from the outside. And I think that's part of our generation, is say, well, let's go inside.
But what it really interests me about this is that in advance of this project, there was an awful lot of admiring it as a great thing in the distance. I mean, I know obviously that Simon Rattle has spent years studying it, but has taken 20, 30 years to get his courage together to conduct it. When I work as chorus master on this piece to different choruses all over the world, I constantly go in front of a choir, not in this case, but normally, who have done it so often that there are so many traditions and wishes there that almost whatever happens, you're going to come up against criticism as soon as you open your mouth. So the interesting thing this time has been that the choir, the Rundfunkchor, had never done this piece before. So I thought, here I was in Germany doing this enormous piece of German repertoire, but actually it hadn't come up in living memory. And that was interesting, but I was particularly...
And the reason, by the way, is of course because, as with the orchestra, this music has been property of the early music movement for the last 20, 25 years. So groups like the Rundfunkchor or like the Berlin Philharmonic have just been told hands off.
That's right.
So what's beautiful is this generation is actually coming to it as music we all grew up with, and at the same time you weren't allowed to play. And so the actual sense of discovery of this group of musicians is quite amazing because they're actually having this music in their fingers for the first time in that way.
But at the same time, I suppose we've got in our ears what's been done by Herwege, Gardner, Koopman, Norrington, and so on and so on.
And I have to say, this project, I would never dream of touching the Matthew Passion. I simply wouldn't. I wouldn't. It was out of the question. And when I was here a couple of years ago with your awesome chorus, we did the John Adams Flowering Tree. And in the back there, nobody would leave the hall, the auditorium at the end of the night. We just sat in the back over beer and said, what are we going to do next? And I had my first experience of this hall, the Philharmonie, and this 360. And I had not been here before that experience. I live in Los Angeles, and I work a lot in Disney Hall, which Frank Gehry built after coming here. And being quite inspired by this place. And so I know the 360, but to come and see this particular pentagonal 360 degree was so thrilling. And I said to Simon and to your amazing chorus, because you guys said to me, let's do something now that's not John Adams, let's do something that belongs to us. And I just thought, oh, Bach must belong to you. And I said, well, in this hall, you could do the St. Matthew Passion in Bach's imaginary spatialization of two choruses face each other, two orchestras face each other, a kind of musical cross where there's no proscenium and people aren't performing out, but they're performing in to each other. And what you're getting is a community engaging with itself. And you're watching a community work through issues together. And it's not about for show. It's not that we've figured this out and now we're going to show you how we do it. We really have to talk through this stuff and work through this stuff. And Bach wrote the music of that kind of mutual engagement and mutual regard. And one of the most moving things is one orchestra has to listen while the other orchestra plays. One chorus has to listen while the other orchestra sings. So equal time is spent playing or singing and listening silently and having to be receptive and take something in. You know, as a performer, you're usually putting stuff out.
Yeah.
And what's so thrilling about the structure of this piece is you spend half the night having to open yourself to receive, which for an orchestra member or chorus member is pretty extraordinary.
But you've developed that further, haven't you? Because in a traditional concert performance of the St. Matthew-Passion, you might have the soloists out at the front and the conductor telling everyone what to do, basically. And because we've had the luxury of time and the luxury of discovery together, and because we've come to it without preconceptions in the first place, I was extremely surprised and delighted by the way you worked initially with the chorus, that actually we didn't, I expected that you would tell us to move to the left or move to the right or something, but actually we spent, 8 days just discussing the music. You basically rehearsed us.
Just the text.
Exactly.
And just where's this music entering this text, and where's this text entering this music? And also, where do both of those things enter the lives of these people? And I think for me, the most moving thing about this chorus is that you feel every human being there. You don't get a group. It's not like a giant box of something. Every person's different. Every person brings their own history, their own emotional life, their own personal hopes, their own imagination. And what I just invited people to do, because what this piece is about, it's not theater. It's a prayer. And so it's a meditation. And so at the beginning, I invited them to dedicate the opening chorus to someone they care about, to someone who's still with them or maybe not, or someone who's leaving the world now, or somebody who needs their help or their thoughts or some act of kindness. And to make the performance of the music itself be the prayer that reaches that person, whether they're here or whether they're gone. And when we do the earthquake, to say, well, don't act like, oh my God, it's an earthquake. Make that a 2-minute prayer for people in Haiti right now who lost their homes, who lost their families, because Bach wrote the music for us to place everything we hope and care about into the vessel of this music. And the music will not only carry it, but elevate it.
Just breaking in there a second, one of the things that's been interesting to me is that for the last 20 years, I've prepared the piece for different conductors, and always the starting point has been style.
Right.
And then this is the first time in my life where you just don't care about style. I mean, and actually no one here does do that. And it's wonderful, because actually it's been, what is the piece about? What are we feeling? What is Bach trying to say? And the revelation for me in this has been the exploration of every chorus, every chorale in a different way. And I suppose the most exciting thing is that my memory of this project is going to be, it's the chorales that are the centerpiece of this, the heartbeat of this work, because I suppose I'd always seen them as a series of very nice hymns that happened,
or commercial interruptions.
That's right.
Now to our sponsor.
and that we were, under those circumstances, always terribly concerned about whether you phrased a note off or how long the fermata was. And in fact, what we've done is something completely different, isn't it? We've invented 20 different pieces of music. I have to say,
it's also because you and Simon Rattle, but I mean particularly you, because you have such a rich history. How many times have you prepared this piece?
20, 30.
And all over the world, as you said, and I was particularly moved by the exploration you did with Ricardo Chailly and the Concertgebouw, who were trying to reclaim the Mengelberg tradition of a symphony orchestra doing this piece, and the Concertgebouw owned this piece in a certain way in the 20s and 30s. And what does that mean? And of course, Furtwängler performed it every 2 or 3 years here in Berlin. Mm-hmm. And it was part of the lifeblood of the Berlin Philharmonic as well. We came to think of that as symphonic Bach. But where are we now with that? What's beautiful is Simon Rattle has done so much with the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment and has himself really explored early music practice for 25 years. And you also have been trying to imagine a different set of choral sounds. So it's incredible. I mean, you're the best dancer. You're not a bad conductor, but you're a great dancer. And I love the way you dance when you conduct. It's like thrilling, and you keep insisting. You keep insisting that there's dance inside this. That dance movement that is inside everything doesn't mean it's lightweight. It means Bach is about movement, not stasis. Bach is actually about being in your body, not being rigid and frightened.
But is that the most important thing that we've tried to do here? That actually, but that this is not a staging, but what it is, it's just freeing everybody up to move naturally.
Exactly. Just
get
to
rid of the scores, get rid of that
just
tension.
Well, first of all, having everybody memorize things.
Yeah.
The soloist, the chorus, the instrumental soloists meant that we were starting by heart.
Yes.
And what by heart means is by heart. And that's all Bach is actually asking for, is your heart. So start there. And people have to reach inside themselves for the performance. The performance is not outside you in this book, but you have to go inside and draw the performance out from your own resources. That's beautiful. But the other thing I have to say, Simon, I mean, you're, first of all, what's cool about working with you is you always have a super practical solution to something that, for me, I know what a feeling is. I know where something wants to go, but I don't necessarily know how to get it there. And you always have this just brilliant way of giving the chorus a super practical thing that creates an utterly mysterious, haunting, profound reality.
But what's been so great about this is that I don't necessarily see or smell the idea in the way you do. And I think what's been great about this is the huge number of days we've been able to spend doing this together, and the way Simon Rattle also got involved at a very early stage, visiting choir rehearsals while we were working things out.
I think one of the most phenomenal things about this choir, which I love, I mean, I just love these people. I really just love them, and you can't miss the tenderness and depth of their response. But also their incredible patience. The word that Bach repeats over and over again is Geduld.
Yeah.
And, you know, these people have had you in their face, me in their face, Simon Rattle in their face, that crazy Dutch guy, Frank, and everybody tells them, no, this is the word to emphasize. No, diminuendo over here. And then the next day it's all changed. And they have had now, for this entire time, every day, everything change. And what's so beautiful for me is it gives the performance, it's like a Rothko painting, is that underneath that blue there was a red. And underneath that red, there was some weird, strange yellow. And then we're putting a new color on top of everything. And so you get something glowing from the previous layers, and nothing is ever flat. Everything has such richness of depth, and you feel complex layering of meaning, because we've all approached these chorales so many times from so many points of view.
Yes.
And even now what Simon Rattle is doing in a given performance is different from what he did the night before. And the chorus has to go with it, with their full range of imagination, their full range of in-the-moment response, and also the histories of everything we've ever said about that phrase, which turns out to have been a lot.
Yes.
And so that kind of depth is one of the things that makes this performance very, very, very moving, because there is more than meets the eye, and there is more than meets the ear. And that came because our rehearsal process happened in so many different parts at so many different times with so many different people.
And how did that, one of the most rewarding things for me was when the orchestra came together with the singers. Perhaps we'll take the orchestra and then the soloists, but when the orchestra came in, tell me a bit, tell me how we did this, because this was interesting, wasn't it? That a lot of the time Simon simply got the choir to sing and asked the orchestra to play what they heard.
The first orchestra rehearsal in Salzburg was thrilling, because literally the choir had been working on it for weeks and came vivid and in incredible dimension. And they sat right opposite the orchestra, like right there, and they would sing. And the orchestra listened, and I have to say, the Berlin Philharmonic, this group of people, the level of musicianship is beyond belief. And so the responsiveness to the subtlety and everything that was involved in the choir's deep commitment, but also incredible range of nuance, the instrumentalists picked up right away. They weren't part of the weeks of rehearsal, but they actually absorbed it in on that Sunday morning in Salzburg. And also the other layer here was inviting the principals to memorize their roles. So they already had, again, that sense of commitment, that sense of personal engagement. I think what happens often with an orchestra is it can be like working in the post office. It can be a very anonymous thing. And what we got from the chorus was everyone's personal response. And now what we're getting from the orchestra is a range of incredibly personal response.
Indeed.
So you don't just get a corporate answer from this orchestra. You're getting different people responding as very intelligent, very gifted artists.
But there's a particular way you work, because you with all of us, you didn't very often tell us what to do. You sort of sowed the ground so that people could respond in their own way, and that does require a certain, I don't know, what should I say, confidence on your behalf. I mean, have you always worked that way?
Well, I've been spoiled most of my life with, as in this case, are there better people in the world? I don't think so. I mean, I'm working at a very high level because this chorus is at a very high level. This orchestra is at a very high level. These soloists. I mean,
Amazing.
Mark Padmore,
Yeah.
I don't have to sit and teach class and say, Mark, this is the part of the evangelist. It starts here and goes there. He walks in as the greatest evangelist in the world right now. You know, Christian Gerhard walks in as the great Christus, you know, in the Passion tradition of his generation. So I don't have to teach class. I can begin with people at an incredibly sophisticated level because I can trust that they're already bringing into the room with them such a rich artistry and heritage and understanding of a tradition and so on and so on. And then I can invite them to move to what is a new place for them. But it has to be a new place for them, not a new place for me. It has to be whatever their next point of arrival is. And what is very moving in the performance is watching people arrive at the next new place they needed to go to in their lives. And so my work is always just the invitation. They know where the next place they need to go is.
But nevertheless, I mean, you described that very well, and that's exactly what's happened. But nevertheless, it's an unusual thing to happen.
Well, you know, it's just the basic. My line of work, it's a service job. You're just trying to be helpful and help out around the edges. And one of the things that people have is inhibitions, and they need permission to go to the place they always wanted to go or always imagined or something. Or the material itself has been presented to them in a very rigid, limited way. And in a case of a piece like the Matthäus-Passion, it's just infinite. And it shouldn't just be that we have this restriction, that restriction, that restriction. You say, well, actually, the words of Jesus, there isn't just one way to hear them or one way to say them.
Well, that's been particularly interesting in the small roles, because we have, I think it's 9 small soloists.
Yes.
Some of them have 6 or 7 phrases, and half of them only have one phrase. And yet we spent as much as sort of 40 minutes with individual singers on one phrase, didn't we?
Yes.
Phrases that so often just go, well, you're not in the garden with Jesus, and that's it. And in fact have become big events, haven't they?
Well, you know, again, as in life, so in art, it's actually little things that make a huge difference. It's like in your life, it's the little things that actually tell you about the big things. And so the more you can focus on the little things, and that's also Simon Rattle's genius, and it's also your astounding radar, where you just know when to move in on some pinpoint, and it shifts the entire meaning just because you gave this tiny little note, and the whole piece suddenly opens. And I think for me, it's often these little tiny things that actually unlock the secret door, where, in fact, you didn't even know there was a door there, you thought it was a wall. And the very thing you thought was a wall becomes the door. And for me, it's always identifying the obstacle. And Bach's music is, you have to go through that, not around it. Figure out what you don't want to deal with. Okay, now you know where you have to go. And so it's actually very basic, is you set up the obstacle as the path.
Yes.
And so you can tell what people are resisting, or you can tell, I mean, for example, the Jewish choruses, a very complicated history of performance of those things. We have received a performance tradition of how to perform the music of the Jews that is, frankly, anti-Semitic. And I don't think Bach's score is anti-Semitic, but I do think the way we have been taught to expect to hear these choruses is.
Yeah.
And so literally just saying, well, now how do we detox that? And how can we imagine that these are also human beings? And how do we imagine that Bach wrote music for human beings? Because, of course, Bach wrote music. I mean, Bach is the most human composer ever. So why would he not have written human music for the Jews? So that's been very moving, is exploring something that everybody assumed was an open and shut situation. And say, well, actually, no. We really need to rethink it from the ground up and go back to the score where Bach actually has no tempo marking and no dynamic marking. And why does it have to be fast and loud and stupid? Why can't it be mysterious and strange and have a whole range of feeling and a whole range of haunted, conflicted, hurt, anger, regret, confusion, and deep understanding.
What's really fascinated me about the last month or so has been that you obviously come to the musics from so deep inside the music, and yet you're working with one of the world's, if not the world's greatest conductor, who's also coming with his own set of values. And how does that relationship work? Because there must have been good days and bad days.
Well, I mean, I'm probably one of the very few people who is as detail-obsessed as Simon Rattle is. And so both of us just are going into details, and both of us are cutting across from very different angles frequently. And there would be days, I mean, there was, I think you probably remember, the crisis day in the chorus, when they finally, somebody in the chorus, I think Holger, said, okay, now please, Peter, tell us, who should we be loyal to, you or Simon Rattle? Simon is asking for this, and you're asking for that. And I had to say, you know, as always in art, the answer is both. The answer is not either or. The answer is both and. The truth is about this yin-yang, is something is true if and only if its opposite is equally true. And what's beautiful about the richness of the palette is Simon is pushing very hard in his direction with incredible seriousness and intensity of purpose. And I'm equally coming to it with a lot of quiet intensity. And to me, what's beautiful about the performance is that you get both things, and that's why there's nothing more beautiful than collaborative work, is we're all saved from our own ideas by the other people in the room. Or our own ideas get so much richer because somebody else adds something that you would never have thought to add. And so it's, in fact, that's Bach's musical composition is dialogue. Everything is dialogue. It's this chorus talking to that chorus, this soloist talking to that chorus. Everything's in dialogue. And that dialogic relation is what's so thrilling about this music. And so being in dialogue with you, thrilling. Having Sir Simon show up with a whole other set of imperatives, and as you know with Simon, it only comes in the form of imperative. He's so sheerly fiercely, deeply committed. And also, I have to say, Simon, I think, came reacting against a certain tradition where this music was pompous, boring, slow, ponderous, and represented a kind of officialdom that our generation doesn't hold dear. And I think, if I could say, what I think he's tried to make and what I think we're all making together is a new tradition for the piece that's not ideologically based, either in the old Victorian idea of religion as a giant, heavy, top-heavy ceremonial occasion, but actually a much more personal ritual of real transformation, not of going through the motions. Or the Karl Richter sense of this is church doctrine. And the doctrine is this, and it's laid out with that kind of confidence and clarity, and no questions are asked. But the music itself is presented as a statement. And I think for our generation, we come to this music actually as a series of questions, as a series of possibilities, as Bach's composition is open-ended rather than as closed forms. That these forms are actually open-ended, complex, deliberately contradictory, and Bach is deliberately trying to unearth a new set of possibilities.
And do you think these new possibilities, because we've sold the thing out 5 times and we could have sold it out another 10 times, I'm sure, we're supposed to live in a time when there is less formal religion than there was in former generations. Do you think actually that the world is full of people, nevertheless, seeking after an understanding, and that the concert exploration is actually a great way to do it these
Well, I mean,
days?
again, what's so great is we're doing it in a concert hall, not a church. Nobody has to be a believer to walk in the door. And every human being has a spiritual life, of course.
Yeah.
Really deep, rich spiritual life. How do we talk about it? Well, actually, art turns out to be, in our generation, one of the ways we can talk about it. And what artists have traditionally done with religion is created something that moves above and beyond the doctrine. Michelangelo went way beyond Catholic doctrine. You know, that's what's so thrilling. And doctrine, of course, is the reason there are religious wars. That's why people kill each other. Massacres occur because of the doctrine. And actually, religion needs to live beyond the doctrine. There has to be this other zone. And I think that's what artists can begin to enter and open up and share and create a really beautiful shared space. What do we actually share? Could we ask that? And could we find that? And so to me, that task of finding what it is we share, rather than simply what divides us, is one of the things I think we're able to do as artists to move beyond this or that sectarian viewpoint. And the Matthäus-Passion, I think, towers above the institutions that created it. I mean, I think, you know, when Bach first performed it, nobody said, that was great, would you do it again?
No.
Actually, they said, well, that was a lot to deal with. I'm not sure we need that. And it was over, you know, and Bach put it on the shelf and did not perform it for the next 25 years. You know, there was no place to perform it in the institutional life of Bach's lifetime. So for me, it's an indication that the piece already existed above and beyond the institution that supposedly gave it birth. And that's why I think our task is to keep, with every generation, looking into it again and seeing another set of things that the last generation couldn't possibly have seen. And meanwhile, the things that our predecessors saw, it's good to know what they are, to acknowledge them. I mean, there's a famous night where I drove Simon crazy by playing him the Furtwängler. I played him parts of the Furtwängler recording, which were impossibly slow, but also so moving. And he got the English horns truly to sound like soprano saxophones on the south side of Chicago in 1953. And he was performing it in Vienna in 1954. And he got the sound of early R&B that was being created on the south side of Chicago that year in the Golgotha Recitativo in part 2. I mean, these things are deep, and it's not about style, it's not about the surfaces. It's about a feeling that's moving around the world at a certain moment. And that Furtwängler was channeling that into the last Matthäus-Passion of his life, you know, already as a person who was not given a clean bill of health after the Nazi period and had a limited performance career. And there's a story that when he, while he was waiting to be allowed to perform again, and he was forbidden from giving concerts after the war, while they were weighing his case, Martha Höfgen visited him, and they sat in his living room and went through the alto arias from the St. Matthew-Passion. And that's what he was doing during his period of silence, because that was the music he went home to in that part of your wounded self when you don't know if you have anything else left. And the idea that this music is music of ultimate refuge, that it's finally where we go when all the questions of style and fashion and so on just cease to matter because your life gets so serious and you have to face things that are so difficult. And this is the music that's waiting for you.
Now, we've talked about people who came to this at the end of their lives or as a last statement. This is the first time we've done this together. Many people on the stage are doing it for the first time. Do you want this project to come to an end this week, or do you see it as a life's goal?
Well, again,
to develop this?
my hope is, and I think Sir Simon shares this, and I think you and your thrilling chorus share this. I think this is a life work. Mm-hmm. We're going to spend our lives on this. I mean, you don't exhaust this piece first time out.
No.
And we've tasted it. We've found certain unforgettable things. And we found certain things that you find with, beginner's mind, a kind of wonderful Zen moment of encounter and discovery. But you also want to grow into it now, and you want to go from here. And I think Furtwängler programmed it every 2 or 3 years here in Berlin, and I'd like to think that we will start that tradition again.
Yes.
And that this will become identified with this hall,
yes,
with this chorus, with this orchestra, as something that's not reproducible, as something that truly belongs here and is part of the identity of this group of people. And because there's lots of ways to do the Matthew-Passion, for God's sake. But this is a very particular way of doing it because these are a particular group of people coming together at a particular moment in their own histories. That is really extraordinary. And again, I if I could just say in terms of where people are coming from, I love that Simon Rattle didn't grow up with Bach. Mm-hmm. He grew up resisting Bach.
Yes.
And he grew up with Gershwin and Stravinsky.
Yeah.
And Kurt Weill. And that Simon comes to Bach also with Stravinsky ears is thrilling.
But what's been so interesting for me is I've worked with him for 28 years now, and everything I've done with him has been thrilling. But we've been always dealing with the upper floors of the building because we've never dealt with the foundations before. Oh. And suddenly what's happened is we've put into place in the building the St. Matthew-Passion. And actually no music since then makes sense if you don't know the St. Matthew-Passion. And one of the most extraordinary things in the last weeks has been seeing him doing Wagner, for example, playing like a child with a new toy, saying, "Oh my God, look, he does the same, Wagner does the same as Bach. Look, he's asked the same question 29 times," or whatever. I think it's going to be a very important moment, and I think the most important thing about all this is the idea that we can all reclaim Bach's music, that we've gone full circle, that we can all learn from each other, but that it is no longer the preserve of small ensembles.
Well, and I think, again, what we've done is so absolutely taken on board so much that we've learned from the last generation. At the same time, we have to do something that reflects who we are and what we're trying to touch in this music. I would also add that each of the soloists comes with incredible tradition. I mean, Mark Padmore has done this all over the world in so many versions, but in particular a very famous version at Glyndebourne where they went into such depth with the text. So what's beautiful is he's walking into the room already as a repository of a tradition. Thomas Kvastov, has sung this since he was a kid, and again comes into the room as a repository of the tradition. What's thrilling is to get these people who are the embodiment of the tradition to explore new territory and open themselves in courageous, unbelievably courageous performances, physically, vocally, spiritually. I would really add one of the things that is thrilling is Magdalena Kojena. Everybody is waiting for Christa Ludwig, and she doesn't show up. Magdalena, is so bold and shocking. Somebody said, oh my God, she's doing Carmen, not the Matthew-Passion. And of course, that's the point. Mary Magdalene is shocking. And that's just what the disciples said, is like, is this appropriate? And that's the same thing people around Jesus said, is, I don't think this woman is in the right place here. And Jesus said, would you people be quiet? Come over here. And again, the physical love, the physicality, the wildness, the daring, the boldness of Magdalena's performance is thrilling. And of course, to have Camilla Tilling move into let the soprano be courageous and truly on the edge of life or death. One of the great gifts is Camilla is, 8 months pregnant? Any day now.
Yeah.
And to have Blüte Nor sung by an expectant mother, to talk about who your child might be, and what does it mean when you're the mother of a child who commits a murder, and you have to love them. And you have to love them even more because the world hates them so much. And that content goes into those arias, that the kind of intensity of Ausliebe, which is frequently sung as just beautiful high flute music and high soprano, but that we have Emmanuel Pahud and Camilla singing about the last moments on earth as somebody's struggling for their final breath, and the actual pain of death on each of those Sterbens, and that each fermata becomes terrifying as you think that person is gone. And as you sit with them in that hospital room, their eyes open again and they say one more thing. And the pain of what they're going through in their body. And that this music is sung through pain so often, which is what it means, when we say no vibrato. It's not just a stylistic question. No. It's actually about the harmony becoming searing, and that we're singing into the dissonance, not as a stylistic question, but that Bach is saying we are passing through pain on our way to a beauty so pure. And I think, your chorus does this incredible thing in number 20. Recht bittern is what the Süße is made out of.
Yeah.
And this idea is all over Bach, that it's only not by avoiding the Recht bittern that we arrive at Süße, but the Süße is created out of the Recht bittern.
Yeah.
And so the performance energy that these extraordinary people are manifesting is going to their own place where they're least proud of themselves, going to their own place of fear or hurt, deep hurt, and performing from there. And out of the most bitter experiences of their lives, arriving at something so Süße and transcendent and life-giving and transformational and courageous that we're privileged to be in the room with them.